There's a peculiar irony in the way the human heart learns. It rarely gains its wisdom in moments of comfort, but in the quiet ache of absence. And sometimes it takes the silence of a woman walking away, not in anger but in self-respect, for a man to finally hear the truth that love had been whispering all along. When a woman chooses to let go of a man, something ancient awakens within the structure of his psyche. It is not simply a romantic rejection. It is a withdrawal of psychic energy that once affirmed his sense of value, his desirability, his identity in the relational space. The masculine principle, throughout history and myth, has been constructed around the notion of pursuit, of conquest, of overcoming something distant, unknown, or lost. When the feminine pulls away, not out of manipulation, but from clarity and necessity, it invokes this primal pursuit instinct. The woman, once emotionally accessible, becomes a symbol of what was once possessed but is now unreachable. And within this loss, the masculine ego begins to stir, often in confusion and contradiction, but deeply drawn to retrieve what has now entered the realm of mystery. This dynamic is not rooted in the surface-level games of modern dating strategies. It's far deeper than that. It's embedded in the unconscious. In myth, the hero always chases after the maiden, the queen, the sole figure that offers him transcendence or meaning. But only once she has withdrawn does he understand her value. He does not begin the journey until she is gone. He does not wake up to his deeper longing until her presence has faded. So too in real life. When a woman lets go, she disrupts the habitual cycle of emotional security. The man, if he has not yet reached a mature level of awareness, may have taken her presence for granted. Her emotional availability, her nurturing, her belief in him, these were constants. They form the background of his emotional world, and when she detaches, he is left not only with her absence, but with the gaping hole her presence used to fill. This withdrawal triggers a profound dissonance. It is not just about missing her. It is about missing a part of himself that only emerged in her presence. Her leaving forces a rupture in his psychic structure. The woman becomes more than a person. She becomes a symbol, an archetype of lost wholeness, of inner connection that he now realizes he did not fully appreciate. The ego resists this awareness at first, often reacting with anger, denial, or attempts to distract with new pursuits, but these diversions eventually fail, and what is left is a pull toward introspection. The mind returns again and again to the woman who let go, not simply because she was desired, but because her departure initiated a loss of inner balance. Letting go in this sense does not produce longing because of scarcity. It produces longing because it reactivates an unfinished story within the man. The energy that once flowed between them is disrupted, and now he must make sense of the silence. This silence is not empty. It echoes with every moment of her presence, with every look, every word, every emotional depth he had perhaps overlooked. Her letting go becomes the threshold of a deeper confrontation with his own capacity to feel, to commit, to honor what was real. And in that confrontation, he begins to fall, not for her as she was, but for her as he now sees her through the clarity of absence. Freedom, when introduced into the emotional landscape of a relationship, does not always create distance. It often sharpens clarity. When a woman decides to let go, the man is not simply left with her absence. He is confronted with a new and unsettling emotional contrast. This contrast is not just between presence and absence, but between emotional safety and the shock of disconnection. It is this very contrast that begins to wake the man up to what he was truly experiencing. even if he could not articulate it while it was unfolding. The comfortable rhythm of emotional availability is disrupted, and suddenly, in that space where validation, support, and attention once resided, there is silence. But this silence is not peaceful. It is charged with the energy of everything unacknowledged, everything taken for granted. The male psyche, which often seeks constancy in rhythm as forms of stability, finds itself destabilized by such a break. The human mind adapts quickly to what is consistently present. It normalizes affection, access, and intimacy. But when those familiar patterns are suddenly removed, the emotional body does not respond with indifference. It responds with confusion, longing, and eventually introspection. The man begins to feel, often for the first time, the true impact of the woman's presence. He replays her words, her gestures, her emotional investment, not to cling to memories, but because he is trying to make sense of the emotional void that now confronts him. He begins to see that what once felt ordinary was, in fact, deeply significant. The emotional contrast between being chosen and being released reveals to him the depth of his own needs. It is not until the woman chooses herself over him, chooses her boundaries, her self-respect, her own path, that he realizes the extent to which she had been pouring into the connection. He may not have seen the sacrifices, the emotional labor, the quiet ways in which she was shaping the relational field to support him, but in her departure these things become illuminated. Her absence becomes a mirror reflecting not only her value, but his previous blindness to it. This emotional whiplash does not simply create pain, it creates depth. It peels back the surface layers of habit and exposes the emotional reality he was too distracted, too entitled, or too unready to feel. This emotional contrast reveals the weight of unspoken attachments. The man is forced to consider that love is not simply about possession, about proximity or daily interactions. It is about presence, emotional resonance, and the awareness of another soul walking beside you in full autonomy. The freedom she claimed by walking away becomes the very thing that teaches him the essence of connection. It is in her letting go that he sees she was never his to own. And that realization, rather than diminishing her in his eyes, elevates her to something sacred, something ungraspable, yet unforgettable. The emotional contrast becomes a rite of passage. It initiates him into a deeper realm of feeling, one where love is no longer a game of power, but a reflection of consciousness. And often, it is only after that contrast shocks him awake that he begins to fall, not just in remembrance, but in reverence. When a woman lets go, especially from a place of deep love and quiet strength, she unknowingly initiates a psychological process in the man that forces him to confront his shadow. The shadow is that hidden part of the self, unacknowledged, repressed, avoided, that often holds our deepest insecurities, fears, and unhealed wounds. In the rhythm of a relationship, many men find unconscious refuge in the emotional presence of a woman. Her nurturing attention and consistent emotional support often act as a buffer, shielding them from their own inner chaos. But when she steps back, when she detaches with poise and self-possession, that buffer disappears, and he is left to face what he has been avoiding all along, himself. This confrontation does not always appear immediately. At first, it may manifest as confusion or anger. The man might blame her for the distance, criticize her for being cold, or retreat into distractions. But these reactions are often thin veils for a deeper emotional disturbance. Without her there, without her gaze affirming his worth, or her words soothing his inner uncertainty, he starts to hear the voice of his own inadequacy. Doubts that he buried begin to rise. Questions like, was I enough? Why did she leave? Or what did I miss? Swirl through his mind, not just as reflections of the relationship, but as triggers for old wounds that predate her entirely. The silence she leaves behind acts as a mirror. In it, he sees not only the memory of her, but the emptiness he had been filling with her presence. He is suddenly exposed to the parts of himself he had projected onto her, the parts he hoped she would heal, soothe, or overlook. The validation he craved from her was never just about her. It was about his own struggle to believe in his value. Her emotional availability served as a balm for that struggle, but now, without it, he has no choice but to turn inward. This is the moment the shadow begins to emerge. Facing the shadow is deeply uncomfortable. It is the internal reckoning that brings a man into direct contact with his pride, his selfishness, his emotional immaturity, or his inability to fully show up. It might bring forth buried shame from childhood, failed expectations, or unresolved fears of abandonment. Her letting go acts like a key that opens the door to this internal chamber, and once opened, it cannot be closed. They may try to fill the void quickly with another partner, with distractions, or with a show of indifference, but these attempts ultimately fail. The truth is that what he is now grappling with is not her loss alone. It is the loss of the illusion he held about himself. This process, though painful, is profoundly transformative if he allows it. The emotional descent into shadow territory can awaken humility. It can strip away the ego's need to be right or in control and open the man to a more honest relationship with himself. And it is often through this dark night of the soul that he begins to see her differently. Not as someone who left him, but as someone who unknowingly became the catalyst for his growth. Her letting go, rather than being an act of rejection, becomes a symbolic invitation for him to meet the parts of himself he was too afraid to face. And as he begins that journey, he may fall, not in bitterness, but in a strange, aching gratitude, because in her absence he found not just the memory of her, but the missing pieces of himself. When a woman chooses to walk away not with rage or retaliation, but with clarity and dignity, she communicates something far more powerful than anger ever could: self-worth. This act is not rooted in pride, but in deep inner knowing. It signals that her value does not diminish because someone failed to recognize it, and that her love is not up for negotiation when it is not met with the same presence and integrity. This quiet withdrawal unsettles a man's psyche because it reflects a reality he may not have been prepared to confront: that she was never emotionally dependent on him, but willingly present. Her detachment is not indifference. It is the wisdom to leave a place where she is not seen, even if her heart still cares. That distinction leaves an imprint far more lasting than emotional outbursts or pleas ever could. The male psyche often confuses silence with surrender, when in fact, in the case of a grounded woman, silence is the final statement of her boundaries. It is the moment she chooses her peace over her emotional labor. This choice disrupts the narrative many men unconsciously hold: that a woman will wait, that her love will continue to chase, that she cannot fully remove her energy from the equation. But when she does, and she does so calmly, something deep within the man begins to stir. He sees not just the loss of her presence, but the strength of her spirit. She is no longer a participant in his avoidance or his inconsistency. She becomes a mirror of what he failed to honor, and that reflection lingers long after she is gone. What makes this form of detachment so impactful is that it is not performative. It is not designed to provoke guilt or attract attention. It is the natural consequence of emotional maturity. A woman who detaches with grace has already done the inner work to separate her identity from the relationship. She does not leave in order to be chaste. She leaves because staying would mean betraying herself. That self-respect is rare, and it becomes deeply magnetic in hindsight. It forces the man to reevaluate not only what he lost, but how he perceived the relationship. He may begin to see that her quiet strength was never weakness, that her forgiveness was not passivity, and that her efforts were expressions of depth, not dependency. Her detachment reveals the imbalance that existed beneath the surface. It exposes the ways in which her love may have carried the emotional weight of the bond, and how often her needs were silenced to keep peace. Once she is gone, that labor becomes visible. The emotional space she held, the patience she offered, and the empathy she poured into the connection all become glaring in their absence. Then suddenly, he begins to see her not as someone who gave up, but as someone who gave everything until there was nothing left to give. That recognition is not just painful, it's transformative, because it shifts the narrative from "she left me" to "she chose herself," and that realization can penetrate even the most guarded of hearts. This kind of detachment awakens a man's dormant emotional depth. It challenges the habitual dynamics of power and control. It invites him to reflect, to feel, and if he is willing, to grow. The woman's departure becomes more than an ending. It becomes a spiritual message, one that echoes long after the relationship ends. It says, "I will not abandon myself to be loved by you." And for a man truly paying attention, that message can become the first step toward a new understanding of love, not as possession, but as conscious connection. When a woman walks away, the silence she leaves behind doesn't just create absence, it creates a void that echoes with meaning. That void becomes fertile ground for memory to bloom, often with more clarity and intensity than ever before. The male psyche, particularly in relationships where emotional dynamics have become imbalanced or taken for granted, often stores away moments of vulnerability, affection, or intimacy without processing them in real time. These moments may seem trivial at the time: a glance of understanding, a word of encouragement, a quiet presence during difficulty. But once she is gone, those moments are replayed and reevaluated under a new light. The emotional significance of what was once dismissed or minimized becomes unmistakably clear. He doesn't just remember her, he re-experiences her in fragments that now feel profoundly alive and deeply missed. What makes these memories sharper and more emotional is the contrast with the present. In her absence, no one else responds the way she did. No one else listens with the same depth, and no one else offers the same emotional safety. These comparisons aren't sought out consciously. They emerge from the psyche as a way of trying to reclaim what was once available but unappreciated. The man begins to realize that her love was not just affection, it was structure, comfort, identity. She shapes the emotional tone of his world, often quietly, invisibly, and without demand. Now that she is no longer part of his daily reality, every former moment with her becomes saturated with a longing for something that cannot be easily replaced. The memory becomes a living presence, haunting in its warmth and painful in its elusiveness. It is often said that the unconscious is not concerned with time. It does not distinguish between past and present in a linear way. This is particularly true in the aftermath of emotional loss. The man's recollection of her isn't just intellectual, it's somatic. He feels her laughter in empty rooms, imagines her reaction to things he now faces alone, and senses her emotional energy in spaces they once shared. This kind of remembering is not a choice. It's an involuntary response from the deeper parts of the self that now realize what was once dismissed. It becomes a form of unspoken mourning, not only for the person, but for the version of himself that existed with her. What emerges in these moments is not simply nostalgia, it is recognition of her value, her emotional labor, her authenticity. It is the kind of clarity that often comes too late, but not without purpose. Because within this recollection lies a powerful lesson. Love that is real and deep is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, persistent, and often invisible until it's gone. In reliving the details of who she was and what she brought into his life, the man is offered a mirror, not just of her, but of himself. He sees where he failed to meet her, where he projected, where he avoided, and where he misunderstood the depth of what was being offered. And this reflection, if he does not run from it, becomes a source of profound transformation. These memories do not disappear, they evolve. At first they may sting with guilt or regret, but over time, if integrated, they become sacred. They become lessons encoded in emotional experience, and whether or not she returns, the man carries her with him, not as possession, but as a symbol of what is possible when someone loves with presence, and what is lost when that presence is taken for granted. In remembering her, he is invited not just to mourn, but to awaken. When a woman lets a man go, especially from a place of inner alignment rather than bitterness, it often acts as a profound symbolic moment in the man's personal development. It is not merely the end of a relationship, but the collapse of a structure he unconsciously relied upon to define his emotional stability. In that rupture, if he chooses to look inward instead of outward, to reflect instead of resent, he enters a space of psychological alchemy. He must come face to face with his patterns, his emotional deficits, his fears, and his avoidance of depth. The shock of loss, when met with honesty, becomes the very threshold through which growth is born. A man who once sought validation in control, in pride, or in emotional distance, is now left with a confrontation he can no longer escape, the truth of his own limitations. This transformation rarely happens in a straight line. At first, it may look like denial, followed by attempts to replace, distract, or numb. He may project blame outward to protect his sense of identity, but beneath that reaction lies a fracture, a crack in the ego that the soul quietly begins to seep through. In that crack, if he allows the discomfort to teach him instead of destroy him, he starts to see himself with new eyes, the moments he dismissed, the times he chose silence over vulnerability, the needs he ignored, not just hers but his own, all rise to the surface. The departure of a woman he once took for granted becomes the initiation into the part of himself he never took the time to understand. For the man willing to endure this journey, what emerges is not weakness but wisdom. He begins to dismantle the ideas of masculinity that told him he must dominate, suppress, or perform in order to be loved. Instead, he begins to discover that true strength lies in awareness, in presence, in emotional literacy. The very loss that once felt like a personal failure begins to reveal itself as the most honest feedback life could offer. Through her absence, life is not punishing him, it is asking him to evolve. It is telling him that love without depth cannot last, and that real intimacy requires courage, humility, and attentiveness. In time, this man may start to feel gratitude, not for the pain, but for the mirror it offered. He begins to understand that the woman who let him go was not cruel. She was wise. Her walking away was not rejection, it was redirection. She did not leave to hurt him, but to honor herself, and in doing so, she unknowingly invited him to do the same. Her exit becomes the spark that ignites his transform. He learns to feel what he once suppressed, to listen where he once reacted, to hold space instead of dominate it, and as he rebuilds himself from this deeper place, he carries the memory of her not as a wound, but as a compass, an archetype of love that refused to stay small to soothe his ego. This transformation is subtle but permanent. It doesn't always result in reconciliation, nor does it need to. Its value lies not in rekindling what was, but in creating something more conscious and whole in the future. The man who walks this path doesn't just fall harder for the woman who let him go. He becomes someone capable of loving with depth, reverence, and responsibility, and that, ultimately, is the hidden gift in her decision to walk away. It is not control, possession, or constant presence that teaches a man the depth of love. It is the echo left behind by a woman who chose herself. When she lets go without drama, without demand, she becomes a mirror not of rejection, but of the love he wasn't yet ready to meet. And in that mirror, he sees the parts of himself that long to grow, to feel, to become. Her departure is not a punishment, but a sacred invitation to transform longing into understanding, memory into maturity, and regret into responsibility. And if he accepts that invitation, he does not just fall harder, he rises higher. For in losing her, he may finally find himself.